having a conference on faith, justice and community services for the community service sector is an interesting challenge. And we noticed there probably wasn't a lot of huge response from the sector in terms of people going to their managers and saying, well, you can go to this conference because it's really relevant to your work. There's this question about faith. Is faith something that should be talked about in the context of government-funded services? Well, a guy called John Rawls said no. How many of you have heard of John Rawls? Jason. He was a professor of moral and political philosophy at Harvard University. And he was a professor during the latter part of the 20th century and had a lot of influence in terms of, he wrote a book on theory of justice, and he had a lot of influence in terms of talking about what in fact should be talked about in the public square and what shouldn't. And he really said, no, we shouldn't be talking about faith because we can't prove it. And what we should only be talking about is human rights in the public conversation. And of course, most of you who work in the field know that that's what we talk about. However, other guys in the field say different things, like Stephen Carter, who's a professor of law at Yale University. He says, if we don't talk about faith in the public square, that means some of us have to leave out what we consider the most important element in life. So, that is a challenge. And it's all based on the assumption that faith can't be proved. But I would say to you this morning, can human rights be proved? Can we prove why we have human rights? Why we have a convention on human rights? Well, it's the same. I mean, can we prove the Ten Commandments? Can we prove the Convention on Human Rights? Neither, really. In our field, we have numbers of conferences, and there was a Families Australia conference this year. And in our Communities for Children sector, the emphasis in the past, well, it's really been right from the beginning, but certainly the last 3 years, there's been a policy change which has said that we can't actually do anything unless it is actually evidence-based. So there's been a lot of programs that have been doing a lot of great work with people based on community development models and things like that, which have suddenly been thrown into question because you can't really establish that they are evidence-based. And that's really had a huge impact on a lot of families. And a lot of families who were really benefiting from these programs have found that that they haven't received the benefit that they could have because lots of funding has been cut in some areas and it's been transferred into other areas. There was a conference in Brisbane, the Families Australia conference earlier this year, in which Professor Frank Oberklade from the Centre for Community Child Health said that there are some flawed assumptions in using evidence-based programs. And they were these, that proven programs are permanent solutions to problems that are assumed to remain static, and an assumption that we can take an evidence-based program and apply it to any community or group. Now that is something that goes on a lot in this field, and it's based on what is actually very, very strong in the whole evidence sector, in the whole university sector, and that is this whole concept of reductionism, the idea that we can reduce everything down to a measurable program which has a beginning and an end, and we can measure the differences, and if we do that, then we can establish that it actually works. But the problem is with reductionism is that it reduces interventions to measurable components, but the assumption is that the whole is the sum of the parts. In other words, if you just throw some metal wire, nuts and bolts together on the floor, you have an engine. The whole is the sum of the parts as well as the complex relationships between the parts. Or as Aristotle said many years ago, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So what we're dealing with, when we're dealing with people and we're dealing with families and we're dealing with refugees and we're dealing with homeless people, we're dealing with a whole complex number of issues. Most of you who've been trained in this area would be familiar with the ecological systems model for child development. And this is one that recently was released by the Centre for Community Child Health, which is a leader in this field based at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. And you can see that, you know, child development is impacted by the immediate family hugely and by the household. That's the greatest influence on child development. But then we go out to kinship and informal networks and we see cultural groups, friends, extended family, and faith-based networks, neighbours, peers, etc. And then we go out to the broader village concepts around the development of the child. So faith-based networks are in there, so faith has a little bit of a place in the public square here. If we go back to Yuri Bronfenbrenner's original ecological model, he has 4 layers surrounding the individual, you can see that he has these different layers around, and he was the one who originated the ecological model. And in the second layer, he has what he calls the mesosystem. And the mesosystem is the arrows around and go around up between social welfare services and church groups. A little bit less politically correct there. He actually refers to church groups. The mesosystem is the second layer from the individual surrounding the microsystem and encompassing the different interactions between the characters of the microsystem. For example, the relationship between the individual's family and their school teachers or administrators. In order for an interaction to be considered part of the mesosystem, it has to be a direct interaction between 2 aspects of the microsystem that influences the development of the individual. Now that's all very complex language, but basically the relationship between the individual's family and their teachers, it's the relationships between the different parts of the system that are really, really critical. So, in other words, how services are delivered is as important as what is delivered. Rigid focus on program fidelity is misguided and needs some flexibility. This is Professor Frank Oberklade again talking about this issue. We need to move from checklists and screens to relationships. Relationships should be at the heart of the care system. Positive relationships with service providers are the medium for effective delivery of programs. So there's been a whole focus in recent years, a whole lot of thought being given to the fact that relationships are really, really important in everything we do. And how do you measure that? How do you establish an evidence base for love? Well, we could quote the Beatles, I suppose. All you need is love. You could quote lots of singers, lots of music, lots of culture, lots of poetry. But how do you measure that? We are working with complex systems, and I don't know how many of you have gone into systems theory, but this is just a look at the complexity of the American strategy in Afghanistan. Now, I'm not going to go into every little detail of that, but it's complex. We live in a complex system. There are a whole lot of things interact upon each other. The way this works out in practice is really interesting. Robert and I had a conversation just yesterday. He'd been to the SNAKE conference, the Aboriginal conference, the big conference every year, and it was in Canberra this year. And there's a lot of talk about getting children back into their original family, into their homes. And he was telling me about a family that he's worked with for the last 5 years, worked really hard with, trying to reunite the family, but the family just were kicked out of their home a couple of days ago because a whole lot of complex issues around that. And the issue, if we just focus on one aspect, that children should be reunified with their parents, if that's all we focus on, it sounds great, but if we don't take the whole complex system into account, we're going to make some bad decisions. So, another thing that we kind of struggle with in our community services sector is, how do we improve productivity in community services? And that's a big question that the government asks constantly, and it's asking that question again. In our sector, and we all know here that with community services, what we think we need to do to improve community services is what? What's the current focus? We are now doing a lot of... How are we trying to improve the services that we deliver? We're doing a lot of training. Okay? Is training going to do it? Well, it can. It can help. Obviously, it has a key role. But if we look at the whole complex system, it may not be the only thing that has a role. As the perceived training requirements increase, it adds to the initial problem since more employees go to training and are unavailable to work. As the amount of overtime increases, employees spend less time with their families. This has a negative effect on their morale. As the number of managers steps in to do the duties of those employees who are absent, their ability to perform quality supervision decreases. This decreased supervision increases the number of employees who are late due to the fact that their morale is decreasing, and they also know that due to the lack of supervision, they will probably get away with it. A delay symbol, 2 vertical lines, are introduced in the above diagram, which denotes that over an extended period of time, absences from work will increase as sickness takes hold due to decreased morale due to continued use of overtime. And that's what that is referring to. So, again, it's a complex system. We might change one thing, but it's going to have a whole lot of impacts on a whole lot of other things. And when we think about this, it is so complex, and there is no one little evidence-based program that will actually be able to make sure we do something that is always going to work for everybody, which is the assumption that a lot of people in dream world live with. So, I'm just trying to say that we are dealing with a complex world and complex systems, and what we do, we really need to have this understanding that improving a system is different from improving a program. And another speaker at the conference that I went to recently in Melbourne called Evidence for Impact spoke about that. Programs can be planned, implemented and evaluated, but it is not possible to plan and specify each of the detailed actions necessary for a system to produce better results. It's just too hard to measure. So if you're only able to do evidence-based programs, a lot of what we do is not going to be on the table, and we're not going to be able to consider it. This conference in Melbourne earlier this year, I was really, really thrilled because some things were said which were really, really interesting. Jason was there as well, and we met each other there and talked about some of the issues, but I was also having conversations with the director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies, who's the one her team are responsible for deciding which programs are considered evidence-based and which ones aren't. And so we were having lots of interesting conversations around about that time. And Michael Little, who was the expert from the UK who was speaking about this, said at the end of a panel towards the end of the symposium, he said that evidence-based programs are not the future. In fact, he said he's over evidence-based programs. And if you don't believe me, you can go to our website, and there is a YouTube video of that panel discussion which occurred during that conference, and you can see at the end where Michael makes that statement. And it really did challenge a lot of the thinking of a lot of the people who were there. In the back of that conference room, one of the questions that was asked by a man with a very thick refugee accent was, and it was ignored, but the question that he asked was, is it time for an epistemological metamorphosis? Now, what does that mean? Is it time for a change? Is it time for a change in thinking about epistemology, about what we actually believe? Who's that fellow? Have you heard of that guy? You probably haven't, because most of you are a bit young for that, but that's Einstein. And Einstein, one of his favourite quotes was, "Science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind." So, what is the meaning of life? Is the big question. I don't know, the computers are down. How many of you Google the meaning of life regularly? Actually, there's a lot of fantastic information when you do that these days, which is wonderful. So how did we get here? What's the probability of the Big Bang Theory? Any of you worked it out? There's a... well, if we don't know what the answer to that question, what do? We go to the most highly rated university in the world. What's the most... If you've seen the university rankings just come out about 3 weeks ago, what was the most highly rated university in the world? You probably didn't read that avidly, but I noticed it, and it was actually Oxford University. And Roger Penrose is now Sir Roger Penrose. He was a professor of mathematical physics at Oxford University, and quite a number of years ago now, he worked out the probability of the Big Bang Theory happening by accident. And he said, this now tells us how precise the Creator's aim must have been, namely to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the 123rd power. This is an extraordinary figure. One could not possibly even write the number down in full. In the ordinary denary notation, it would be 1 followed by 10 to the 123rd successive zeros. Now, how many mathematicians in here understand that? But that's not just 10 with 123 noughts. I mean, one theory says, I think, that, in fact, if you counted all the atoms in the universe, it would be 10 to the power of 80. So I don't know if you get your head around that, but it's a huge figure. And to say, I mean, that's the most commonly accepted theory of how it all began is the Big Bang Theory. Well, the probability of that happening is so minute. We should think about that. Did it all happen by accident? And if we take that question off the table, if we just say, well, we're not going to consider that, so faith has got nothing to do with anything, the meaning of life has got nothing to do with anything, we'll just focus on our evidence-based practice and we'll just go with pure science and we'll do what Richard Dawkins and others say, we'll just throw out this faith stuff, we're really being very, very narrow and small-minded. And in fact, as of last week, I don't know whether you saw a report that came out last week and was in the media, but in fact the Big Bang wasn't the beginning after all. In Forbes magazine, there's a new article by a scientist came out saying that the Big Bang wasn't the beginning after all. We don't quite know what it was, but there must have been something before the Big Bang. So guys like Lawrence Krauss, who talks about everything came out of nothing, that is being questioned by other people. Okay. Dostoevsky, the famous Russian novelist, said in the Brothers Karamazov, if God is dead, everything would be permitted. And we need to think about that because that is what we see happening in our society today, in our communities today. If we don't have a moral framework, if we don't have a defined moral and ethical framework, everything's up for grabs. And I guess you see that in the same-sex debate. The AFL has got a right to talk about moral and ethical issues, hasn't it? Anybody has a right now to talk about moral and ethical issues. And there's kind of been a shift from that being the sphere of the faith communities to anything goes. And there used to be this delineation between church and state, and church had some moral authority in some areas and state had in some other areas. Now that's been completely thrown out the window. So Tim Costello, who we're going to be hearing from in a while today, says in Streets of Hope, his first book, the moral framework is no longer a society but merely an economy which has recategorised citizens as customers, where only winners are lauded and those without spending power become invisible. So that is probably pretty accurately our current moral framework in terms of government decision making. Is that something that we are committed to? Is that something we believe is important? Is that something that maybe we need to challenge? The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child states that states parties recognise the right of every child to a standard of living adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, moral and social development. And a lot of people don't kind of like that and try to ignore the fact that that statement is in there. And probably we'll have some legislation soon taking it out, I guess. But that is one of the articles in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Every child has a right to spiritual, moral, social development. Without an ethical moral framework to hold them together, families and communities and nations easily disintegrate. So where does this moral and ethical framework come from? If you believe Richard Dawkins, he says faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and to evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, and even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. That's his opinion. Another opinion from Associate Professor of Philosophy at the UC Berkeley. Faith doesn't require believing more strongly than the evidence suggests. With what faith requires is being willing to act on the basis of the evidence that you have. There's a lot of fantastic stuff on the veritas.org website about these issues, which we need to be thinking about. Now, let's go to community services and what works in community services. You've all seen the iceberg illusion, or some of you have seen the iceberg illusion. What's on the top, what people see, depends on a lot of things that are underneath. So, there we have community service at the top, but underneath we have concepts of justice and beliefs, values and attitudes. What about the concept of good and evil? Is there a rational reason for that? Do we have evidence for that? What happens as soon as an event happens like happened in Las Vegas a couple of days ago? What are the headlines? What's the word that comes out most often? Is there good and evil? Well, I think in today's Advertiser it actually makes quite clear that there was a whole arsenal of evil in the room occupied by the guy who was the sniper in that event. So the word evil comes out, and we use the word evil readily because inside everybody knows that there is good and there is evil. There is what is just and what is unjust. And underneath a lot of the decisions that we make, our beliefs, values and attitudes are very, very influential in our decisions. So beliefs, attitudes and values are really, really important. The way it actually works in our society, this is called the Golden Triangle of Freedom, and it was developed by a guy called Os Guinness, a thinker originally from Oxford, actually a descendant of Guinness whiskey people from Ireland, I think they were. But he said freedom requires virtue, which in turn requires faith of some sort, which in turn requires freedom. Only so can a free people hope to remain free always. So in a democracy, in a community, if we are going to be continually free, that freedom is going to be based on people being responsible and on people making responsible decisions and responsible choices, which is the word virtue. And where do you get your moral compass from in terms of what you consider to be virtue, what you consider to be good choices? Well, it comes from faith. It comes from some sort of faith. And if we don't have that, we begin to lose freedom, and our countries, instead of being democratic, they become dictatorships, they become totalitarian, and we see that happening in countries all around us. That is why we're having such a huge amount of displacement all over the world. That is why we have refugees everywhere. The amount of refugees that we have now in our world is huge, because there are some really evil dictators and some really evil totalitarian governments who are creating absolute hell for people in so many countries, and all they can do is just desperately try to get out and find a place to have asylum and find a place to be free. And it's a huge problem everywhere. And they're going to the countries that at least have some semblance of a society that is just and believes in justice. And usually the roots in those societies, you'll find, comes from faith. This is just some statistics about the world's largest religions and their number of believers. Christianity, 2.1 billion. Islam, 1.3 billion. Non-religious, secular, agnostic, atheist, 1.1 billion. Hinduism, 900 million. Chinese traditional religion, 394 million. Buddhism, 376 million. Primal indigenous, 300 million. Now, the question then becomes, well, if faith is important, and if a moral compass is important, and if a belief system is important, which helps us develop ethical and moral foundations for families and communities. Which faith? And there are a lot of commonalities between those faiths. I had the experience, it was a wonderful experience actually, of working with a group of Malaysian medical students who were being prepared to do university courses in medicine in Australia quite a number of years ago. And they were mainly Muslims, and we had 6 months together, and I was teaching them English to use in the courses that they were about to do. And we had some wonderful discussions about ethics and morals. And we agreed on pretty much everything. We had so much in common about a lot of the social issues of the time that we were engaged in that training. So there are lots of commonalities between the different faiths, but there are also some differences. And we need to be aware of that and think about that too. And most of the differences actually between Christianity and a lot of the other faiths are about the person of Jesus. Who is Jesus? And the evidence of the resurrection. Did the resurrection really happen? And if the resurrection really happened, well then what do we do about that? That has some huge implications. So evidence again is something that, as that quote we had before from the Veritas Forum, faith is not blind. Faith has to do with evidence as well. And it is based on evidence. So that's the kind of issue that we need to think about when we're thinking about that issue. So, to today. A few months ago I walked into Timecodes and I was looking at all the latest books. Adelaide is a place where we love all the latest books and the latest ideas. The Open State Festival is on at the moment, and what we're doing tonight is an event which is going to be part of the Open State Festival with Tim Costello at the Hawke Centre in the city. And we're a bit like the city of Athens. We love to talk about ideas. I saw this book in the Timecodes bookshelves, and I thought, faith. And I bought it and read it and found it very fascinating. Tim Costello is a guy who we'll introduce in a little while, but he has a lot to say in this area because he's lived in both the secular and the faith world for so many years. He started out as a parish priest in St Kilda, working with some really interesting street people, lots of prostitutes and people from different countries, and it really brought him down to earth, I think. So he's walked in this sphere for quite a long time. One of the things he says here in the book is, I live the tension between faith and the secular. Secular people generally welcome what I say, but suggest I drop the spiritual mush. Religious people are disappointed that I have not turned up the volume on faith. The chasm between the two camps seems to be growing. Maybe I'm foolish to try to span it. Well, maybe we're foolish to try to span it today too, but at least we're going to have a go. And we're really looking forward to some things we might say which actually allow a little bit of a discussion about the whole faith side of things, faith communities, the role of faith communities in the public sphere. And because I believe they're absolutely critical. I'm not going to say any more than that. I think Campbell can pick it up from here, and I think he's going to focus more on the refugee communities and what faith has to say about them.